Now, this is one of those battles which I'm doing this year, I'm doing in the Year of Leadership, and people are probably going to wonder why the frigate is a naval historian who obsesses too much over Iron Brew, doing a video about Swiss... Well, let's put us on it. The Swiss, what's sometimes called the Swiss Peasant Army, but actually should be called the Swiss Canton Volunteers, fighting the Landsknecht of Maximilian I in what is both a glorious victory, definitely a land battle, and also one of the last battles where the Swiss really were as military dominant as they had been over the previous centuries, because the Landsknecht had now learnt their techniques and were about to start really deploying them in far larger numbers. So why am I talking about this battle? Well, the reason I'm talking about this battle is because if you want a battle, if you want a piece of history which really does demonstrate the value of having a leadership which actually pays attention to what's going on around it, which actually adapts to the situation, and having a sense of forces which have a sense of common purpose and common goal, and how successful that can be even when you are outnumbered, even when you are theoretically being played by a system which is so much more centralized and supposed to be so much more organized and so much more able to play the fancy games of higher strategy versus you. This is it. This is the war. Because the contenders are just that nuts. We have on one side the nascent Germany of the Holy Roman Empire under Emperor Maximilian I, who, yes, I kid you not, that is probably a real-life portrayal of his chin. I mean, the chin, the nose, and he thought this was a good painting of him. He really did. So there is something going on there, definitely something. We can be honestly certain, and this is not speaking as believing I am the most handsome person in the world, I really am not, but the fact that his son is then called Philip the Handsome, and I've seen paintings of his son, it's more of a thing of Maximilian, okay? But this is the Habsburgs, and this is where the Habsburg chin does begin. So, he is famed for trying to unite and build up the Habsburg Empire. He's also famed for the fact he loses his family lands in Switzerland to the Swiss Confederacy, and that he regularly finds himself, whilst able to fight everyone else, well, the Swiss cause him trouble. And the reason the Swiss go to war with him? Well, it's quite simple, really. He decides he wants to tax them. And he was taxing them in the name of German imperial unity. Yes, I kid you not, he was trying to unify through taxation. I've heard of worse ideas, but I've heard of quite a lot of better ones. But that was his plan. It was unify through the common penny taxation and through the Imperial Supreme Court, and to try and push these things and form one nation, one organization, one empire, one standard of rules. And for some reason the Swiss were not keen on this. The Swiss, who were fiercely independent, tend to be fiercely organized and fiercely self-contained, was for some reason less than keen on this idea. I can't think why. I'm fairly sure the Roman Empire could have informed Maximilian of this one, but, well, the Holy Roman Empire was different. That's what I'm told. As it goes, it doesn't really work. So then he comes up with the idea of what he'll do is he'll provoke them into war using the Swabian League. Now, Swabian League is where he is a sort of loose confederation of towns and houses, etc., where he's been paying Swiss mercenaries to train up the armies of, to generate Landsknecht, which are some pretty cool troops, and they do fight in a very similar style to the Swiss who trained them. Now, the point is, the Swiss by this point have been famed for roughly the previous 200 years for how well they fight on the battlefield. They were an important addition to anyone's empire, and you can understand why they're wanted. But the Swiss themselves are, as said, fiercely independent, and they usually like you to have a very loose hand on the tiller. Switzerland has and will forever be, with the way it's structured, a retail politics focus, i.e. it is increasingly and incredibly local in its political function. This means that you trying to centralise control of it to a state which is far away from Switzerland doesn't work, because you're never going to have enough familiarity with the local issues to win over the required electorate. They don't see the justification of you. And by the way, there are modern political projects which are running into the same issue when it comes to the Swiss. It's always fun to watch when you see these various negotiations going on, and people just not understanding why the Swiss don't understand the reason that it makes life easier to join them or be part of these larger projects. And the answer is, it's ultimately because Swiss politics is incredibly local. Incredibly local. I love that about it, and it's always a wonderful thing to see, but it is incredibly retail politics. It's incredibly focused on the doorstep and local discussions. Now, Swabia had been an area which he had more control over, so he built up a personal army there. And so his plan was, okay, they don't want to do tax, so what I'll do is I'll raid them. I'll earn enough money through raiding to pay for the army, so I don't have to fund it out of central taxations. All good. And I'll earn some glory, which will give me the ability to be stronger with elsewhere, and I'll bring the Swiss to heel. Unfortunately, he forgot he was dealing with the Swiss Confederacy. Now, the Swiss Confederacy is a very interesting organization. Technically, it was the old Swiss Confederacy. Now, it's a precursor to the modern Switzerland. It's not exactly the same as it. And in fact, there are bits on this map which are added later, and there's even... Switzerland is a fun place. But this is pretty much the original cantons. If you add it on, but there are 13 there. 13 originals. But in this period, what we're talking about, they have 10. And they're not exactly heavily populated. This is the main problem once they teach people their secret sauce of their fighting techniques and how they work together. Because the trouble is, everyone else has a lot more population to deploy in it than they do. So they have to use terrain and speed and smarts to their advantage, and they have to start changing their formations again. Which the Swiss do, but the Swiss are adaptable. And the thing is, from the outside looking in, if you are used to a monarchical system, it can look an absolute mess of disorder and disorganization. It can. It can look an absolute mess of disorder and disorganization. But the reality is, the Swiss system was incredibly efficient at weeding out people who were not going to do the job to the best of their abilities. They might not all be equally able or equally gifted, but they'd all do it pretty much to the best of their abilities. And whilst there would be some who would initially get positions who wouldn't do it to the best of their abilities, they wouldn't be in post for long. There's also the fact that surviving in Switzerland at this time, thanks to Mother Nature, and the very nature of Switzerland itself, is kind of a process of natural selection in and of itself. It really is. And then you add in the fact the Swiss like to go off and be mercenaries and do various other things. The people who come back, the people who raise families, the people who live there, they usually the people who they're going to pick and put in charge when there's wars to fight are usually going to be people who have earned their position and have got the experience in it. This I actually find is a bit of an advantage when faced with some of the political considerations of nobility which go into selecting senior commanders in other nations and other organizations and peoples at this time. It's one of the ever so interesting things, realistically, that the nations which seem to do better long term either grew out of the process of selecting people purely for their noble background in terms of leadership, or never really adopted it in the first place. There's some interesting examples of that, but we'll leave that to one side. With the Swiss, they are together. They are together. And in this period, we're talking about Uri, Schweiz, Unterwalden, Lucerne, Zurich, Glarus, Zug, Bern, Freiburg, and Solven had all joined by the point of the 1499 war. Interestingly enough, Basel will join in 1501. Schaffhausen was joined also in 1501, and Apprazel, which is a lovely rural canton, it is a lovely rural canton, joined in 1513. And it's a lovely area. It is a lovely area, and it grows. Switzerland grows as it does, not because of great big campaigns of conquest, but because people choose to join it. And usually the groups choosing to join it are looking at the Swiss and going, your system makes sense. And it feels peaceful, and it feels suitable to the terrain. Because this is the thing, Switzerland is an island of very large mountainous territory with some beautiful valleys in it, which can be very rich and grow lots and lots of crops, etc., but in a very short growing season. You have to make smart decisions. You have to plan ahead. You have to think long term, and you have to think about everyone, because if you think just of yourself, there is nowhere else to fall back on if things go wrong. And this is what breeds the different politics in Switzerland than, let's say, the Holy Roman Empire with Maximilian I, who is... I'm trying to think of nice things to say about him. I really am. He's certainly very trying, and he's certainly very Maxi of a Maximilian. No, I've got to be better than that. The problem is, there is such a debate about him as to whether he was the last knight, as he often likes to portray himself, in terms of his PR campaign, or whether he is... well, how do I put this? It's more appropriately should be called Maximilianism rather than Machiavellianism in terms of its policies. Because we always have to remember, Machiavelli was, to an extent, doing a tongue-in-cheek advice when he writes it, then we name this whole system after him. But it's still an interesting system, and he is the author of it, even if it was tongue-in-cheek reference. And is arguably the first Renaissance prince, achieving the height of European dynastic power, using a methodology which would make some of the modern Crusader King free players blanche. They would literally go, you did that? He did. He is focusing on his dynasty above all else. That is the reality. And whilst others have tried to produce a positive image of him, I really don't think he's necessarily that good. I think he's good at politics. I think he's good at diplomacy. and think he's good at Dynasty. I think he's good at playing like he's good at Warfare. But considering the amount of big frigating mistakes he makes in Warfare, including how often he divides his forces and the other force gets annihilated, I'm not sure if he really is the example of leadership you want to draw from. I do realise that he has good PR at the time, and it sometimes comes up, and it's quite a good, attractive PR. But myself, if I had to pick at the time whether I would be led by Maximilian I or Nicholas Conrad, the mayor of Solherin, I'd have probably picked Nicholas. I really would have. Because at least that's a guy who actually considers what's going on around him from a practical perspective. But with that all being said, and before we get into the actual Swabian War as it's called, and the battle itself, shameless book plug time. Now you might be wondering, Alex, again, this is not going to seem a very long video. No, it won't be a long video. It won't be. I'm not going to do a massively long video about the Swabian League and the war and all these things, because as interesting as they are, and as much as I'd love to do a long video about them, it's not really my area. This is more a passion video for me. This is a topic which I find really interesting, and I know a bit about because I've gone on and read, and I read some PhD theses, and I've gone and studied various books and things that have been a hold of, but it's not my area of specialism. But sometimes I like to put this in here because I'm a history geek. And not many people might enjoy this video. There might be some people who really dislike me as a naval historian popping into this area and going, look, this is stuff. But I like to do it because one of the things I like to do as a historian is to reach out to other areas, is to go, what can we learn from each other, what can we study? And do you know what path led me into studying the Swiss pike formations and finding out about the Swabian War and all their formations? It was the development of boarding tactics on ships, and the fact that there were captains in the Royal Navy and captains in the Dutch Navy who were reading books, and some of the first history books done on the Swabian Wars, because they were looking into the tactics used by the Landsknecht and the Swabians, the Landsknecht or the Swabians and the Swiss troops, to try and work out how they can better fight with pike aboard ship. The first thing that comes in is, okay, well, so we need to be giving space to these people. And I'll be talking about the battle techniques, etc. in the next slide. But we need to be giving space to these people for their fighting capabilities. Well, yeah, you need to be giving them space. There is no space on a ship. And that's one of the reasons why the boarding pike, if we consider it, is the size it is. It's not the same size, normally, as the pike which you'd use on land. It's got to be used in a more confined space. But you've got to work out, okay, how much space do we need? How many of people with boarding pikes do we need to dominate a certain area of deck? And you start to work it out, and you start to work it through. Okay, how do we arrange our personnel on the deck? Because the thing is, you want to be able to hold the maximum space with a minimum amount of people, because any people you're using to fight on deck are people who are not manning cannon. And that's a problem. Anybody who's having to hold a pike to fend off boarders is not firing a musket, is not firing a pistol, is not crewing a cannon, is not doing stuff up in the rigging and the sails to keep you attuned with the wind. So you want to get the maximum benefit out of them. And whilst I don't say there are a lot of captains who do this, there really aren't. But there are enough captains because it needed to be worked out. And they report it up and write reports, and they become standards. And before you know, you have all sorts of naval manuals come out. And where do the naval manuals get their information from? They don't really tell you. So that's one of the reasons why you have to go up and look up the authors of the manuals. Then you have to go and look at them and find out various stuff about them, and if you can find and track down their archives or records of their of what they were interested in, etc., you then go track that down, and that's then you find the sources. And that is how I ended up studying the Swiss and their pike formations and finding them absolutely intriguing in the simplicity, the efficiency, and the organization they achieved. So yeah. A bit of a random thing for a book plug, because instead of me plugging my book and saying thank you like I normally do, and I'm going to say thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing to this video, I'm explaining why I'm doing this video. Because it's fun for me, and because, as I said, my path into it was through naval history. But this is, again, the thing with history, as I always try to explain, it's so interconnected. You cannot really have those nice, neat silos. You really can't. You go diving off very quickly. Anyway, the Swabian War. Now, this is a really interesting war because it basically shows you how little of it takes place in Swiss Confederacy. It's all on the edges. And this is a problem for Maximilian because if he's going to get money from raiding, he needs to actually be fighting in Swiss territory. But he isn't. They are managing to hold him at bay. They're managing to hold positions. They're managing to keep him mostly contained outside of Switzerland. But it does mean that in this war you don't get large concentrations of them being able to mass their various forces on whole against each other. You don't get the main Swiss army coming together as a united force to fight Maximilian's force. You get a lot of disparate little fights. But the thing is, they don't really adapt their tactics in terms of their doctrine of how they're maneuvering. Both sides are broadly speaking keeping to what I would call the Haufen or the heap system. Now, I have a wonderful couple of pages description of the system in front of me, which I've got up in my notes, which were written by a gentleman called Albert Winkler in his article in 2022 for the Swiss American Historical Society Review. And I could try and put it in my own words. I should probably put it in my own words, but I'm actually going to quote from this because it is so beautifully written, I honestly don't think I could sum it up better. The Swiss first developed the tactics that both they and the Swabians would use in the Battle of Dornach in a lengthy development that took nearly 2 centuries to complete. The Swiss developed their advanced infantry tactics. By the Burgundian War of 1474 to 77, the Swiss had developed their mature military system usually deploying for battle in 3 square battle formations called Haufen, heap, mass, or pike squares. These squares were arranged close enough to support each other, but were also capable of independent maneuvers. Rows of men on each side of the structure wielded pikes, which were spears roughly 18 feet in length and were designed to thwart cavalry attacks. In the center of formation, the men carried halberds, a pole 5 to 8 feet in length, with an axe blade for slashing, a spear point for thrusting, and a hook for pulling cavalrymen off their mounts. When gunpowder came into use, this formation also used men with harquebuses, or early muskets, to shoot at their enemies. Arquebuses, that's basically. They also used arrows and archers. This is me bit I'm adding. They also used archers earlier on and crossbowmen. They would use range units from within inside the square, so it gave it a very flexible formation. Again, in many ways, it's dealing the same issue which the Romans had been trying to do. How do you maneuver large formations in formation where they can work together on land in the confines of battle? Because if you have everyone deployed as one big block, it's its most powerful, but it's also its most unwieldy. So it's working out how you're going to do it. When engaging the enemy, the pikemen would strike first. These troops often stood the length of one arm or about 3 feet apart, so that they could wield their weapons effectively. The space between the men allowed the halberdiers to rush past the pikemen to engage the enemy at close quarters using their shorter weapons. If the pike square was surrounded by superior forces, it would stop advancing and then turn its weapons outward in a formation called the eagle, hedgehog, to meet attacks from all directions. Once formed, the hedgehog was never penetrated by enemy forces in over 200 years of combat. Now, the fact is, the Landsknecht, which were the German mercenaries, German soldiers of the Swabian forces and of the Habsburg Emperor Maximilian's armies, they have been trained in this system and are attempting to copy it. Now, it is such a firm system that the Swiss often maintain it, even when they're crossing rivers, etc. But it's also got its limitations. One of the examples I will talk about in this battle is we're going to be talking about them and their approach and how they were getting to the battle itself. And the fact is, they give away their maneuver somewhat by making a lot of noise passing through a forest because they are trying to keep to a formation. Now, admittedly, moving 1,500 to 3,000 personnel through a forest is never going to be done quietly, frankly, no matter what you do. So, that's life. But there are ways of making it slightly quieter by dividing up into smaller parties and filtering through more easily. But that means then when you come out the other side, you might not be in this formation and ready to react. It's always a problem. Balancing the two. Balancing force cohesion with force effectiveness. And yes, this war does just last January to September 1499. Maximilian really put a lot of effort into it. He really thought he was going to win it very easily, and then when it turned out he wasn't, he backs down. Because, honestly, you either win a war quickly versus the Swiss, or you don't win the war. Because of the nature of their terrain, because of the nature of Switzerland, and because of the nature of their organisation. Campaigning actually inside Switzerland, it's a nightmare. Your troops could be not far apart, but they could be in completely separate valleys. And you can find the Swiss all around you, and the other troops can't come and support you. So Switzerland is really not a good place to go campaigning. You either win quickly, or you don't win at all. And to be fair, Maximilian, he does back down once he realises he ain't going to win, but getting into it in the first place seemed to me to be the silly manoeuvre. So let's come to the Battle of Dornach. Now, this battle is an interesting example of, and I'm going to quickly shuffle forward to this, which I have prepared as backup, of Maximilian trying his ideas, because around here, it's Constance. And that's where he's demonstrating with a large army, trying to show, I'm going to do something here. Basically having artillery drills most of the time. What he's trying to do is lure the Swiss there, and then attack over here in Dornach against Dornach, which is a strategic castle, strategic fortification. And that's his cunning plan. If I draw you over here and I attack over there, you won't be prepared. Now, the thing is, when you're dealing with a distributed Swiss system like the Swiss run, that isn't actually necessarily a good idea, and don't necessarily work for you. And it doesn't work in this battle, because the locals are still paying attention. The locals are still there, they're still paying attention. And furthermore, he managed to put the force under the command of Heinrich von Fürstog. And Heinrich was not probably the most active commander. Now, the thing is, he starts assembling his force in May and June 1499, and he managed to get between 10 and 15,000 troops together. They were incredibly varied in quality, is the phrases which comes out, but that's probably because most were conscripts, whereas there was a good core of the Landsknecht from Gelderland, but that's roughly 2,000 experienced core mercenaries who are then training up the rest of the force to their capability. But remember, they're put together in May and June. This battle takes place in July. We're talking, they're expected to adapt to tactics and combinations of fighting very, very quickly. Now, these are not actually the easiest systems, because you have to have forces which are trained to trust each other. And that takes time to build up. And when you're bringing together formations from different areas and you're trying to build them together, you're basically trying to carry out what was be described as professional army style tactics with feudal army levies. It doesn't work necessarily. They had a cavalry, roughly 1,100 of the very specialist Welsh Guard, which were French troops from Burgundy. Heavily armoured, but they forgot to pay them, so they weren't really that motivated, and will spend most of their battles trying to look for loot. Right, Heinrich, i.e. Fürstenberg, doesn't march immediately. He's trying to train up his forces, trying to get, and this is why he, instead of him charging off in July, at a point where he would have probably found no one there. Instead, when he finally starts moving, he finds that Benedict Hugi, who was in charge of the garrison, and this is the thing, the Swiss have professional garrisons in these fortifications, had managed to complain so much to Solfern, the mayor, the same place where the mayor Nicholas Conrad, who commands the troops, comes from, later on, that they had actually sent masons, they had sent personnel, and they had sent artillery pieces to strengthen the fortress. This wasn't finished by the time that Fürstenberg, Heinrich, is getting his troops there, but they've actually sent it, they've actually responded. And the thing is, already, even before this, Solothurn has sent, well, when I say Solothurn has sent, the councils agreed to Nicholas Conrad, the mayor's plan, that he should lead a force of 1,500 men to a nearby village to watch the area with the aim of harassing imperial forces should they advance. They, in the meantime, also sent out notes to surrounding allies, including the army sitting at Constance, about what was going on. And these forces start to dispatch troops towards him. It's kind of interesting. Maximilian believes he's holding down the Swiss at Constance. He doesn't seem to realise that the force which he is holding down is getting smaller and smaller in front of him. He doesn't seem to notice that fact. And also, Bern, which had been angered by the various Swabian raids on it, decides to send 3,000 men to help Solothurn. Now, in total, the army in Dornach that they're facing, the Imperial Army, was probably more in practice about 12,000. It's described as being 10 and 15,000, but honestly, it's probably about 12,000 effectives. It's probably about 12,000 effectives looking at the data. It's a considerable force. They had artillerymen, but they were the only ones who were really doing much. They were mostly focusing their artillery on the castle. And in return, the troops in them and the cavalry were doing pretty much nought, it would seem, because they hadn't realised there was 1,500 men that close to them, i.e. 4 miles away, let alone that they were being joined by more and more. And as the troops start to arrive, the other Swiss troops start to arrive, Nicholas Conrad, who has been watching the Imperial forces from Schaffel Hill, sorry, I mispronounced that, notices that they are being so poorly organised and goes, I bet I can launch a surprise attack on these people, and I reckon it's going to crush them. And you'll be surprised at what happens next, because this hasn't been building up to this. By the afternoon on 22nd of July 1499, he has roughly 5,000 high-grade troops. 5,000. And even though some, like the Bernese troops, the troops from Bern, had arrived lacking enough food and lacking enough water, it had been amazing. Nicholas Conrad's forces from Sullivan had masses of extra that they'd been able to supply them. Almost as if someone had been thinking ahead and doing logistics and working out, well, let's bring a lot of food with us, and then troops can concentrate on rushing to us instead of carrying food with them. Or coming from closer. We want the troops from far away to be coming. It's almost like there's some organisation and thinking going on, and they share wine and other lovely food with these soldiers. They still had 1,000 troops, 600 from Luzern and 400 more from Zug, coming up. But Conrad manages to guide the Council of War to his opinion, to his plan. And they start to go to battle, even though they are outnumbered nearly 3-1, 2.5-1 probably, and they don't yet have these 1,000 troops. But they decide to do it because they think if they go quick enough, if they go early enough, they'll be able to do something. They'll be able to hit the Imperials as hard as they can. And they also decide that if they manage to get there quickly, they can conclude the battle before nightfall. And then they also hope that those contingents would arrive before nightfall to help conclude the battle. But most importantly, if they conclude the battle before nightfall, that's going to put the Germans, the Imperials, at a disadvantage. It's going to force them to withdraw in the dark, which is going to magnify their casualties. They decide to form into 2 pike squares rather than normal 3. They decide to form a Vorhut, vanguard, and a principal formation, the Gothorden, the main formation. They decide that Luzern and Zug, and they leave notes for them, would be a rear guard, the Natrund, when they arrived. They would be useful in that position. And that is pretty much what they do. And they decide to march through the forest instead of using the road, so that the Imperial forces won't see them coming. Again, I would love to say this didn't work. Taking 5,000 troops in a formation of roughly 3,000 and roughly 2,000 through a forest should not be a silent endeavour where there are no pickets to spot you if you're facing professional soldiers, or anyone of any competence, especially someone who has cavalry, so could have thrown out a line of horsemen at various positions to provide them with some warning. But 'twas not to be. What's even worse is some people describe this battle plan as complicated, but it's really not. Nicholas Conrad would be commander of the Vorhut, the van, and they would go straight for the cannon, which they would take and try and disable and destroy. And they would divide it into 2 groups, with a smaller group going for the small artillery pieces and a larger group going for the big artillery pieces, whilst the main body would come through and then support them, and hopefully they would fight a battle. They again have to leave their own cannon behind because getting them through the forest was going to be too dangerous. Now here's the thing, you might have heard me not mention much about Heinrich other than him divering, Heinrich von Fürstenberg. This is because we don't really know how he'd have performed in a battle, because what happens is he hears noise going on, and instead of sending someone to go and find out what's going on for himself, he gallops over to see what's happening himself. He gets far too close to the Swiss. He gets within pike range of them, or rather halberd range. He is dragged from his horse and killed in short order. This means the Imperial Army has now already lost their cannon and their commanding officer. that the latter one might be less of a problem than the former. Okay, I'm not saying he was a bad commander. I don't know. He could have been a good commander, but the fact is he hasn't got a whole line of pickets out, and he has just got himself killed. I'm not going to rate him that highly. Not going to rate him that highly. And at this point, Nicholas Conrad was looking around going, well, fortune favours the brave, let's charge on. And he manages to start pushing through the centre of the Swabian camp, surprising the men there, throwing them into confusion, and causing the Welsh Guard to flee across the Bure stream. The cavalrymen, the supposed elite professional cavalry, flee. This is so not going good. Now, whilst they have the initiative, we are talking about roughly 2,000 personnel. And very quickly, the Imperial Army, once it does manage to get its act together, and someone does manage to take command, though no one seems to be quite 100% sure who is issuing orders at this point, but there might be a reason for that. There is a possibility they're one of the people who die in the battle, and therefore there's lots of people claiming credit afterwards. Or rather, no one wants to claim credit because they lost. They start to push them back. They do start to form up their battle formations. They start to reorganise themselves. The Welsh Guard eventually remember, hang on, we're heavy cavalry. We're fleeing from infantry. What's in us? What are we doing here? And turn around and start doing some things. Unfortunately for the Imperials, just as this starts to happen, just as they start to think we're going to overwhelm the Swiss force, we're going to annihilate them, the Geldhafen, the main formation, 3,000 men from Bern, the Bernese, built like Bernese mountain dogs, arrive en masse. And they advance rapido. Very quickly. They'd had their progress slowed by the undergrowth and by their tiredness, but by this point they were entering the field, they had had food, they managed to warm themselves up, and now they slam into the Landstadt. They slam into them hard. And as they are slamming into them, the van are falling back on them and combining together to form a mighty Swiss host. Unfortunately, at this point also for the Swabians, their cavalry withdraws. They were already dispersed off raiding and doing other things to try and earn money, and the 400 who were still there, out of the roughly 11 to 1,200 they'd had with them, decided that they were more interested in robbing the dead at this point. This shows there had actually been quite enough people die for them to be interested in that. And enough senior people die for them to be interested in that, because they actually had something worth stealing. Some put up a fight, but unfortunately it was the minority. There's also the fact that for the Germans, their reliance, or the Imperials, their reliance on artillery, well, the only artillery which was still potentially workable was already in a fixed mounted position focused on the castle of Dornach. And so they're unable to turn them around. So this is an infantry v infantry fight. And as strong as the Germans are, as strong as their numbers are, they keep being outfought by the fact that the Swiss have ferocity, common purpose, and organisation on their side. Plus, they seem to be led at all levels quite competent. Theoretically, the Imperial forces should still have had an advantage. Theoretically. In reality, the forces keep pushing backwards and forwards, and neither side seems to be able to break the other's rank, and they think that they are, rather evenly matched. And then, just as it's about to turn to nightfall, Lunzen and Zug, the 1,000 extra troops, advance onto the field of battle, shouting, blowing horns, and rushing to join the main strength of the Swiss. And this reinvigorates, this empowers and charges up the Swiss resolve, who then manage to push very hard, and the Landsknecht break. They break. And when the mercenaries break, everything else breaks around them. And the Swiss are following them. The Swiss are following them hard. They kill everyone they can apprehend. And in the darkness and night falling, well, there were other issues. At certain points it seems that the different Swiss factions actually get confused and start fighting each other, and actually potentially inflict more casualties on each other than the Imperials inflicted all day. But it's worked out. It's worked out, and the Imperial army has fled, and they have killed a lot more of the Imperials than they killed of each other. Overall results of the battle: roughly 3,000 Imperial soldiers dead, roughly 500 Swiss dead. The Swiss made sure their people got proper burials. They didn't bury their adversaries. Heinrich von Würzburg's body is taken to a field at the church in Alson, but yeah, that's about it. The main interesting thing about the Swiss is that after it, they don't march on Alsace or Swabian lands. They don't have the interest in that. But they do make a decision that all the wounded are taken nearby towns for care, and that all the booty, all the prize taken in the battle, was divided amongst the wounded and the widows and orphans of the dead. That's not unusual for the Swiss. It's a good methodology, though. It's a good methodology because it means you're going to fight harder if you know that if anything happens to your family, it's still going to be taken care of. And there's also the fact that the cantons themselves would make other arrangements, and locally there would be arrangements made. These men died fighting for us, sort of thing. We look after their families. And the reason you do that is because if you ever die fighting for the canton, you want the canton to look after your family as well, and considering how harsh the environment is, that makes a lot of sense. This all leads eventually to the Peace of Basel. There's another couple of skirmishes and interesting things before all that, but the agreement in Basel means that Maximilian decides that he has decides and agrees to recognise that he has no further authority to tax or put courts over the Swiss states. Pretty much that's a great thing. The big trouble, though, I would say, long term for the Swiss with the Battle of Dornach is that it shows how effective their system is, and that, well, if they can now have more Landsknecht, and better trained and better paid Landsknecht, the Habsburgs think they can have a far better army that can actually win them in battles. That's the problem. Anyway, so it's a good little bit of history. And I normally finish videos with a question. I'm going to say a battle question, but it's a question. And I'm not going to change that now just because I'm talking about a battle in Switzerland. Here's the topic for you. Think about little states, places like Switzerland, places we don't often hear about the military history of. I want you to do me a favour. I want you to go Google those countries. Look at battles and wars in their past, and decide if any are interesting to you, and then comment below, because you might have noticed, when I'm looking ahead to this year, I've got a gap on the 12th of August, the 16th of September, and 23rd of September. I've got 3 gaps. Now, I've got ideas for what could go in them, but I'm always open to ideas of smaller battles, or other things which might be of interest to you. And I might put some of them into a vote for the YouTube members to vote upon, and suggest the topics they want covered. I'm not sure how many topics I can put in a YouTube vote for members, but it seems to be something nice to do. I have to admit, though, not all of them will probably go up to YouTube. Not all those dates might go to YouTube members. I might put some dates, I might just go to people, well, and if you're not a member, you suggested a very interesting title, and a very interesting topic. Because I like to try and bring everyone into history, like I end up going all areas for history. With that being said, what do we have coming up next week? We have the Battle of Gravelines, fighting the Armada. That's a wonderful leadership discussion. Take care, and hope you enjoyed today's video, and a little bit of Switzerland. Have fun. And if you like the videos, please do like, share, and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. But also, I will say this, there is a bell on the subscribe button, and this goes for all content creators. Deciding whether that bell should be filled in and what colour it is one of the most important decisions you can do as far as we're concerned. Because if you have notifications turned on your phone and systems like that with YouTube app, and you have that bell fully filled in, that is the best way for us to grow our channel, because it means that people usually watch the videos as quickly as they go live, and the first couple of minutes, the first 10 minutes, the first hour of watches really does affect the logarithm, and that's for all content creators. So please, whoever you care for most, whoever you are most interested in, you want to support them and want their channel to grow, do make sure you consider doing that, because it really does matter. Thank you.